Welcome back to another episode of Divorce at Altitude. I am your co-host, Ryan Kalamaya. This week, I am joined by a New York City divorce lawyer, Evan Schein, who is also the host of his own podcast, Schein On. We'll get into that, but Evan, how are you doing today?
Ryan, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on. I am doing really
For
well.
those, for our listeners who aren't familiar with New York City divorce lawyers, can you give us a little background? How'd you get into doing work in New York City?
Ryan, it's a great question. Again, thank you for having me on. It's great to be with you and great to be with all your listeners. As you mentioned, I'm a divorce attorney. I'm the head of litigation and a partner at my firm, Berkman, Bottger, Newman, and Schein in New York City. I specialize in divorce and matrimonial law. My path to being a divorce attorney is somewhat unique. And it's a path I absolutely love to talk about for reasons I know we're going to get into. I started my career actually during law school. I was an NFL sports agent. And on the weekends, I would travel around the country, meet with prospective NFL players and their families. And I did that for about 3, 4 years. And I absolutely loved it. It was a tremendous experience. I made wonderful connections in the industry, in the business, and it really afforded me an opportunity to learn about the sports side of business and contracts and players and their families. And ultimately, I wanted to transition into practicing law. And a seamless and a natural transition for me was doing what I do now and what I've been doing, for the past 13 years, which is being a divorce attorney in New York City, something I absolutely love. And I've been fortunate to be able to blend my two passions and what I learned being an NFL sports agent to the practice of matrimonial and
Well,
family
I
law.
gotta ask, Evan. For those that have seen Tom Cruise in Jerry Maguire, did you ever say "Show me the money" to any of your NFL clients?
Ryan, it's a great question. I love it. I never said show me the money, but I'll tell you, Jerry Maguire is one of my favorite old time movies. But here's the thing about that movie, which is great. Jerry Maguire, I mean, it's classic. It's the classic. You're watching it as a
Right.
young kid, you're growing up, and you want to be Tom Cruise. You want to be Jerry Maguire. You want to have athletes and you want to have clients. But the reality of the sports agent business is something totally different. It's a grind. You're on the road, you're traveling, there's a lot of competition. And yes, you're developing incredible relationships, but it's an industry that is ultra competitive. And, I've never said to a client, show me the money, but it's, look, at the end of the day, for a lot of athletes, that's what it's
Yeah,
about.
no, I understand that. I actually got invited to go to the Super Bowl way back. I was a prosecutor, and I was fortunate enough to go. I saw the Patriots lose to the Giants. I don't know if you're a Giants or Jets or New York based fan, but it was the Super Bowl when Tyreek Hill or no Tyreek, I forget who it was, but he caught the ball against his head and it ended the Patriots perfect season. But I went to this party and met John Elway, who was a hero of mine. But more importantly, I met his agent, and he was there, older, and I was fascinated, just asking him like, "Is this what you do?" And he was, because it was like a late night party, and he was like, this is what I do. It gets really old after a while, but John is a very valued client, I'm sure, but he had to be there at midnight and took away from time from his family. And the sexy side can also get kind of old after a while.
100% right. And Ryan, I'm smiling because I am a Giants fan. I was actually at that Super Bowl as well. David Tyree,
Yep.
that catch, it lives in my mind, for the past, I mean, however many years it's been, 10 plus years. Those were the glory days for the Giants, Eli Manning and beating the Patriots. It was a great sight to see. But you make such a great point, and you're right. That's the nature of the business. And it's become even more competitive. And it's out of sight, out of mind. And if you're not there with your player, another agent is. Another agent is looking to move in on your territory. Another agent is looking to make headways with your client. So it's a very competitive business. And watching in the past year or so, a trend that everybody's seeing, a lot of athletes are choosing to represent themselves. DeAndre Hopkins negotiated a $75 million deal last off season, he acted as his own agent. And I think you're seeing that trend. It's not going to be the majority of athletes because there's a huge benefit to athletes working with not only agents, but a team of advisors on the financial side, the legal side, the marketing side. But you are starting to see some very savvy veterans, DeAndre Hopkins to name one, who is looking to negotiate his own deal and, obviously, not have to pay, the agent fee that's associated
Well,
with that.
let's talk about some of those deals and how they could impact an athlete or an entertainer going through a divorce. And so let's go to the financials first. So DeAndre, Hopkins, $75 million deal. What are the unique aspects of that kind of contract? I mean, it's big money. What are the things that if he were to go through a divorce or any sort of professional, athlete, and let's first start with the NFL. Like what are the things that are unique about what you're dealing with in a divorce with a professional athlete like an NFL player?
Ryan, it's such a great question. And I'm glad you mentioned the NFL because the NFL is like no other sport. It's often joked that the NFL stands for not for long, and there's good reason because the physical toll that it takes on an NFL player's body. Look, what makes representing athletes so unique, especially in the NFL, given the physical nature of the sport, athletes earn a lot of money, millions of dollars, often hundreds of millions of dollars in their 20s. And I'm going to say that again because it's worth it, which is athletes peak athletically and financially at a very young age. They often retire in their late 20s, early 30s. Look, unless you're Tom Brady or LeBron James and you're going to play until you're 40, most athletes peak in their 20s athletically and financially. And so when you're representing an athlete going through a divorce, a separation, and the issues come up in terms of child support, in terms of lifestyle, in terms of equitable distribution in New York, and I know Colorado has a similar statute, how you're going to divide assets in terms of accounts and provide for a family going forward, athletes and their families get comfortable and used to living a very expensive, a very nice lifestyle at a certain point in time. But the question and the challenge is what happens when an athlete retires? Some athletes you see go into coaching. Some athletes now make the transition to broadcasting where you can earn a lot of money, but that's few and far between. Most athletes retire. And then the question is, what did an athlete save during their peak earning days? What money is available going forward? If an athlete retires and they're 33 and there's not a lot of money in the bank and there's no job prospects on the horizon, and then the issues of child support, alimony, distribution of assets come up, the questions of what's an athlete's potential in terms of earnings is always something that's going to be negotiated, and it's an incredibly challenging issue. The other issue that's really important, and specifically with the NFL, the contracts are not guaranteed. So when someone hears $70 million deals or a $30 million deal, when you're negotiating a divorce or a separation agreement or a child support number, you want to look at the actual dollars. What is the guaranteed amount that your client and your athlete is earning by which he or she has availability to pay from the source of funds? And a lot of times, if an athlete and NFL player is cut, they're never going to see the back end of that deal. So using your example of DeAndre Hopkins, let's say $50 million of the $75 million deal is guaranteed. You want to focus on that amount of money, not a futuristic amount that he may never realize. And the other unique part of the NFL, these contracts are structured. So many of the deals are incentive based, which is in order to receive the maximum amount under the contract and under the player's deal, there's incentives. You need to receive or you need to throw for 4,000 passing yards. You need to catch 15 touchdowns. You need to play each and every week. So you take an example where an athlete begins a divorce proceeding in week 8. There's going to be a question as to how much of that season is on the table when it comes to figuring out what amount of money there is to distribute and what amount of money there is to pay someone else in the
Yeah, and
divorce.
we before the show, I sent you a because you're in New York, the case here in Colorado with Steve Sewell, and for longtime Bronco fans, they would recognize Steve Sewell, he as the tight end, and but there was actually a divorce case that went up, and it's a published case. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about how that fits into what you just described with the incentives with the NFL?
Brian, it's such a great question and such a great point. And I encourage everyone to read this case because it touches on so many important legal issues that are unique to professional athletes who are going through a divorce, specifically on the issue of incentives and bonus compensation. And I'll make this distinction. In the financial world, let's say you represent someone who works for a hedge fund, someone who works on Wall Street who's going through a divorce. They may receive their bonus the following
Hmm.
year in February or March, but that's a bonus for work that was earned and work that was done the year prior. The distinction with the financial world is that's just when the bonus is paid out. With Steve Sewell in the case, the appellate division made a point to note that in order for him to have received his incentive or the compensation, he had to play in the game based on when the schedule was and when the pay was tied to. So he needed to play in the game. He needed to play in the playoffs to earn that compensation. Had he not played in those games, he would likely not have received that compensation. And so the distinction in terms of filing and the season and what games are played after, it's incredibly
Right.
important.
And you mentioned Tom Brady. I mean, everyone, Tom Brady and Giselle, one of the most famous kind of couples, power couples out there. But the kind of analysis or the analogy would be that if Tom Brady had gone through a divorce with Giselle and it was in the middle of the season, he goes to the Super Bowl. If he had some sort of incentive, which he probably did, just given the NFL, to play in the Super Bowl or the Pro Bowl, that it's a matter of when is the cutoff date for, because most jurisdictions, I assume you and I talked about before with New York, is that generally speaking, in a divorce, a spouse is not entitled to compensation or anything related to earnings after the divorce is final. And whether that in New York is in Colorado, it's based on when you go to final orders or the decree is entered. And so it's when that decree or that final orders hearing goes in can matter in terms of whether that Super Bowl bonus is in play or not, which is essentially what happened in the Sewell case.
100%. And look, if you represented the wife in Steve Sewell's case or Giselle, in your, analogy, look, there's an argument to be made on the other side too, which is the contract itself was negotiated when they were still married, right? So although the money may not be earned because the game took place after, the contract was negotiated when the parties were still married. There was a benefit that what took place during the marriage, and yes, he may not have physically played in the game. He may not have physically stepped foot on the field at the Super Bowl before the marriage, but there's a benefit in terms of the fact that the contract was signed at a certain point in time.
Okay, let's switch gears. That I play baseball. I just my birthday was just recently, and so one of my college buddies sent me a cameo recording from this guy who's like, why didn't you become a professional baseball player? You could have made millions. And my response is I was a mediocre college baseball player. I played against Mark Teixeira, who was clearly way better than me. He played for the Yankees, and but in baseball, had I made it to the major leagues, what's the difference between the NFL, or what's unique about uh, the major leagues?
Great question, Ryan, and great point. When it comes to Major League Baseball, the contracts are guaranteed. So when you hear that someone signs a $200 million deal or a $10 million deal, that's money that's guaranteed, irrespective of injury, irrespective of really anything else. And sure, there's some loopholes, but for the most part, the money's guaranteed. And the other difference in Major League Baseball compared to the NFL, the shelf life for a Major League Baseball player is much longer. And so you have those two distinctions, which are incredibly
So
important.
for Rockies fans that are still bemoaning the fact that Nolan Arenado got traded, the reason that the Rockies essentially had to pay or pick up part of the contract is because it's guaranteed for for out. And so is it your practice or in New York, are you trying to figure out with a baseball player what part of the contract is for after the divorce versus what has been earned during the marriage?
It's a huge factor. It's something that you look at the players' contracts all the time. And the other unique thing about baseball, there's so much deferred compensation. There's so much deferred money. And that may be because the team and salary cap, and that's across all sports. And I think even going back to football for a second, one of the things to look at is the compensation structure is something, the signing bonus that takes place when a player signs with the team, or is it converted to a roster bonus and a deferred form of compensation, which may happen, let's say, after the filing? So understanding the contract, understanding the player's deal, and really the way the compensation structure works is incredibly important, not only in football, not only in baseball, but in all
Right. So
sports.
it's like the Bobby Bonilla, the kind of one of the most famous uh, financial deals. I mean, he's still getting paid out, and he will continue to do so, even though he retired like 10 years ago. And so, if he goes through a divorce, you're having to figure out. So, Eric, or I'm sorry, Evan, what are the who are the kind of people that you're relying on? Are they financial experts? Are they advisors? Are they who are the people that you typically work with in connection with a divorce involving a professional athlete?
When it comes to representing a professional athlete in a divorce proceeding, child support proceeding, anything along those lines, you're generally working with a team of advisors. You're working with an athlete's financial advisor, an athlete's business manager, at times the sports agent who represents the athlete, and the trust and estates attorney. I would say those are generally the professionals that are in the athlete's inner financial circle who are incredibly helpful to me as a divorce attorney when I'm working with a professional
And
athlete.
you do entertainers as well. So let's talk about some of the differences with license deals or endorsements. Which obviously, you can have some endorsement deals like LeBron James or Michael Jordan with Gatorade, or something in that realm. But what are the differences that you're seeing, or that divorce lawyers may not understand, that typically don't deal with these kinds of unique cases?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's going back to something we touched on, which is when is the deal negotiated, signed, and when is the money earned and when it's received. I think that's first and foremost. The second thing is we're living in a time where the opportunities for professional athletes to make money, to brand themselves, endorsements, marketing deals, the social media opportunities have never been greater. And so all this money, all the opportunities for athletes to earn money off the field, even more money off the field. I mean, athletes, you hear the sneaker deals that NBA players have with Nike, Adidas, Under Armour. They're often greater than the actual playing contract. And the opportunities have never been better, never been greater. And so as a divorce attorney, you need to look not only at the playing contract, but you need to understand, analyze the compensation structure on the marketing side, endorsement side, how the money is going to be paid out, when is it going to be paid out, and with respect to entertainers and authors and other people in the entertainment industry, understanding the royalties, understanding when the money is going to be received, understanding the licensing deals and how money is going to trickle in. It is incredibly important whether you're representing the athlete or you're representing the spouse on the other
So,
side.
okay, so you've got the property aspects. So how much money's in the bank, in terms of dealing with the property, but then you mentioned compensation. So when you're analyzing child support or alimony, or here in Colorado we call it spousal maintenance, are there various things that you can do to mitigate, or reflect the risk? So if a player gets hurt and they no longer, they don't have a guaranteed contract, or an entertainer that all of a sudden they find themselves in a controversy, and they lose a bunch of endorsement deals. What are the things that you can do to address that risk going forward?
Right, another great question. And first and foremost, I always say, I think when you represent an athlete and entertainer, it's incredibly important to consider having a prenuptial agreement before the marriage, because a lot of the issues that we're talking about in terms of alimony, in terms of the distribution and how to divide assets, I think that's something that can be addressed before an athlete gets married. But in either scenario, and it's a challenge because here's the thing: An athlete and their family get used to living a very nice lifestyle, often filled with cars and houses and vacation homes, and everyone gets accustomed to living a nice lifestyle, which is great when an athlete's bringing home $15 million a year, right? But what happens when that ends? And an athlete's 32 years old, has 2, 3 kids who are 4, 7, and 9, and the earnings dry up. Or even worse, an athlete didn't save. An athlete didn't have the benefit of a great team, a great financial advisor, sound financial advice, a great estate planning attorney. And so an athlete goes through a divorce or separation in their early 30s, and there's a lifestyle. And so I think these are very challenging issues. And unlike any other type of profession, and you know this from your practice, I know this from mine, it's not that easy for a professional athlete to go out and find a job where the income and the salary is going to be anywhere close to what a professional athlete earned from their incredible physical gifts and playing on the field or playing on the court. So it's a very hard thing to navigate, but hopefully you're able to come to a resolution and figure out a way to maintain a lifestyle, but to do it in a reasonable way that accounts for the physical decline in an athlete's physical ability, which is directly tied to an athlete's ability to earn.
Right. So, I mean, the Tony Romos of the world that were quarterbacks and now are, very successful announcers are extremely rare. And more often is the case is like Mike Tyson or 50 Cent or Adrian Peterson, these various, or Johnny Depp, these various people or entertainers, whether they're sports, figures or entertainers that just overspend. I think that I saw something that NFL players, they file for bankruptcy at even a higher rate than the normal population, which is just a fascinating statistic. If my memory serves correctly.
Yeah, no, I mean, you mentioned you rattle off some names, and look, it's true. And here's the thing, which is we hear these stories, you read about it, you see it on TV, you listen to the news, and unfortunately, you hear about the sad stories. But there was a recent article about Alvin Kamara, the great New Orleans Saints running back, and the article was that he hasn't spent a dollar from his $75 million deal from his playing contract. He's living off and paying his expenses from his marketing and endorsement opportunities. So for all the names that you mentioned and all the stories that I hear, you hear, all your listeners hear, there's also good stories. There's the stories of Alvin Kamara. There's the stories of other athletes who get it right, who work with great financial advisors, who make good decisions and build a legacy for their families. But the Tony Romos of the world, look, he makes probably more money, for CBS than he did playing quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, and that's hard to believe. But, in a case like that, it's less complicated. The cases where you don't go into broadcasting or coaching and you don't represent someone like Alvin Kamara who's handled things the right way, it's much more of a
Yeah, and you
challenge.
mentioned prenups, and my partner and I had previously done a couple episodes at the very beginning of this podcast about premarital agreements, and I mean, they can still be challenged. I mean, Dr. Dre, is going through that, and we hear about them, right? We can drop these names. What are the things that you do, Evan, to mitigate that the publicity, the privacy that people are really wanting, undoubtedly. I mean, they're public figures, but they don't want people to be talking about their personal lives. I mean, they want people to be talking about their results. So what are the things that you can do in your practice to mitigate against that risk?
Brian, I love this question, and I'll take it from both angles. I'll start with the divorce angle, and then we'll talk about it from the prenup side. When it comes to representing an athlete in a divorce, separation, child support dispute, get ahead of it, right? Get ahead of it and get a deal done. Because if you represent an athlete, you want to avoid the spotlight. You want to avoid having this in the media. Part of it, a job of an attorney is to shield the client from everything that comes with a story being out there in the public. And so what I recommend is getting a deal done, spending the time, spending the effort to get a deal done in advance. So certain stories and situations don't make the front page of your hometown newspaper. That's not a position you want your client to be in. In terms of The other part of it is it's harder now than ever before for the same reasons I mentioned in connection with an athlete's opportunity to make money, but social media. It is so hard for athletes and entertainers and public figures to stay off social media. So if you don't post something for a day or 2 days, your fans, the people who follow you are wondering what's going on here. So it's very hard to limit the same publicity that also generates money in terms of branding and marketing and opportunities. But when it comes to representing anyone in the public spotlight, I recommend having non disclosure agreements in place. I recommend having confidentiality agreements in place. And I recommend getting ahead of it and getting a deal done in advance of any joint statement that's issued to avoid the public spotlight that often follows these divorces and public separations for years. On the early side of it, when it comes to prenups, and you mentioned Dr. Dre, and you mentioned, a few other examples, I would put the same language in a prenup in terms of confidentiality. I would put non-disclosure language in a prenuptial agreement as well. And to avoid a challenge, look, you want the strongest possible language in a prenup. You want it to be fair. You want it to be reasonable. There's certain language in New York, which is a requirement. You want to make sure both sides have an attorney. You want to do everything you can to get ahead of it, have a properly signed, executed, and notarized prenuptial agreement. And then if something happens, you're going to first revert back to the prenup and see how to make this work and incorporate that prenup into a separation and
Yeah, I
divorce.
want to get to the social media because that is really interesting. I hadn't thought about that in terms of that can be an issue with these public figures. But I want to go back to one thing that you mentioned in terms of getting ahead of it. I know, at least I read that and what we do in our practice is for these kind of high profile cases that you can often try to get a deal done before even filing. And I think Laura Wasser out in LA that represents a lot of high profile people that at least there were kind of rumblings that Kim and Kanye were going through divorce, but they hadn't yet filed. And in the motivation is to kind of get a deal done before it's even filed. In Colorado, we can file what we do typically, especially in Aspen, where we're representing people that are noteworthy, is to file a motion to limit the access so that the public, the newspapers, they don't have access to the open court file. We can get a private judge. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, we deal with a lot of we do with criminal defense, and especially in a small town like Aspen. That'll be on the newspaper, and people are often more worried about the repercussions of it being publicized compared to going to jail in a criminal case. And likewise, people don't want to have their finances splashed all over the news, the newspapers. So getting a deal done early, and then you can file everything all at once. It's one of those things that you really have to kind of walk your client through to say, listen, you might want to fight on this particular issue, but is it worth it? Because your brand or some other negative repercussion could be a consequence.
Ryan, you're 100% right. And you mentioned the word brand. For so many athletes and entertainers, it's a brand. I mean, it's more than just playing sports. There's clothing lines, there's image, there's sneaker deals. I mean, there's endorsements. You represent, so many athletes are the face for so many companies, and so much thought needs to go into that. And you mentioned it, and you mentioned Laura Wasser. Even with the Gates, Bill and Melinda's divorce, when people are going to issue a joint statement, 9 out of 10 times before that joint statement is issued, a deal's done. So when the filing is made, they already have an agreement and they've been negotiating, and reports came out that this was true. They were negotiating a deal for over a year. I mean, there were reports that came out that Melinda Gates had met with divorce attorneys going back to 2019. When you have the money and the resources that we're talking about, there's a right way and a wrong way to go about this because there's so much more that's at stake, and it benefits nobody. Nobody. When everybody's personal life is broadcast, inside a courtroom, but we're living in a different age. I mean, it used to be 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago where you wanted to know something, you would open up the front page of your newspaper and you would read about it not 10 minutes later, but the next day. Now, when something happens, it's on Instagram, it's on Facebook, it's on Twitter. You're reading about it, you're listening to a podcast about it. I mean, we get our news right away. And so if something happens in terms of an athlete and their brand, or there's a high profile divorce, there's no lag time between when it happens and when we read about it. It's a story and it continues, and people continue to follow it on social media. But there is always a domino effect in terms of an athlete and their brand, or an entertainer and their brand, if something is not handled the right
Now,
way.
yeah, and that brings us to social media. I mean, it's and as listeners know, I mean, we've had experts on social media, and my partner and I have and co-host have talked about it before. I mean, we're very cognizant about, and we talk to our clients about social media, and it's one of those things that it is it can be the source of evidence in a family law case. So, Evan, how do you walk a client that relies on revenue from Instagram or Twitter or some other social media with the balancing being authentic and, being transparent about what's going on in their life versus that it could come back and really haunt them? So, what are the things that you have to walk through with your sports and entertainment clients when it comes to social media, if especially if there are kids involved? And which we'll talk about next.
Brian, I love this question. And what I tell everyone is, don't disparage your partner, don't disparage your spouse on social media, right? The thing about social media, and you mentioned it, in your cases, my cases, the types of clients that we work with, be smart. I understand that social media, there's a financial benefit, to that in terms of the brand, in terms of keeping up with content, in terms of sponsorships, in terms of marketing and endorsements. But be smart about it. Don't use it as an opportunity to say what someone is or isn't doing with your kids. You want to focus on certain aspects of your life because you need to keep up your brand and be authentic for your followers and, people. That's one thing, and that's fine. But far too often, I see too many athletes and entertainers and public figures taking that next step, wanting to disparage or speak negatively about their spouse, especially as it relates to their children. And whether you're an athlete or any client, that's a no-no. I mean, that should go without saying. Nothing good comes out of that. Don't take it to social media. It's not something you're going to want your kids to read about years down the road or be part of it. And again, nobody benefits. If you're going to be on social media, be smart about it. Put up content that there's a benefit to it, but don't take that next level. Don't litigate your divorce on social media.
And I remember listening to your podcast, Schein On, and you told a story about Tom Brady and after he won the Super Bowl and embracing his son. Can you share that with our listeners? I hope you remember what this kind of vignette that I'm referring to.
No, Ryan, I appreciate it. And no, I remember talking about it on the Schein On podcast. And Tom Brady is someone who gets it. Look, not only on the field, and I mean, first ballot Hall of Famer, we can have the debate, best quarterback
Yeah,
of
be
all
careful, Evan,
time
because
or
I mean
not.
we're in Colorado, so just be careful there with
Well, that's what I said. We can have that. I know my audience, and that's why I said, we can have that debate. But look, Tom Brady, he gets it off the field because he has figured out a way to make it work with Giselle and Bridget Moynihan. And there's a history there in terms of the relationship and a son that he had from a prior relationship. But the blending of the families is, and that could be a whole podcast topic, for another day. But the way Tom Brady and Giselle and Bridget Moynihan have managed to blend their families, and you mentioned, there was a moment after the Super Bowl, and he often does this where he wishes, or he looks for his son Jack in the stands, and you see Giselle and Bridget Moynihan, make comments and really positive ones to Tom Brady, wishing him, good luck, and Tom Brady wishes, Bridget Moynihan a happy birthday. Those are the positive comments. That's what you want to see on social media. That's how you want to speak about an ex. That's what you want your child to see. Those are the words you want your child to read, the words you want your child to hear. That's the good stuff. And that's the story, just like the Alvin Kamara story. We don't hear enough about the great things that athletes do off the field, on social media, in the financial world, in the communities, because the attention is on what goes wrong. But that Tom Brady story, seeing that, reading about it, Absolutely
Yeah,
fantastic.
which brings us to parenting. So what are the unique, I mean, you've got the NFL schedule where they're traveling a bunch, or an entertainer that, maybe not over the last year with COVID is, a singer may not be on the road dealing with concerts, but how do you navigate the parenting issues for someone in the sports world?
The key is consistency and stability. It's good for the kids, it's good for the parents. Each sport is different. And so, for example, you talk about, the NFL, and we touched on, the National Football League earlier, but let's talk about it in connection with parenting. The NFL plays in the fall and winter, right? So it's every Sunday. But during, and whether it's a road game or a home game, the athlete is home in the hometown during the week. So it's less complicated because it's one game on Sundays and it's for a shorter time period. But let's talk about Major League Baseball. 162 game schedule. Then you have spring training. A lot of time is spent on the road. A lot of time is spent traveling, and it becomes more complicated. The way I do it when I work with athletes, especially regardless in all sports, you know the schedule in advance. You know the schedule a year in advance. You know when spring training is, you know where spring training is going to be, you know when the playoffs are in any sport, account for it, get ahead of it. Often, when I represent and work with athletes, there's a few different schedules. There's a schedule for when an athlete, let's use the baseball context, is going to be in Florida or Arizona in spring training. There might be a different schedule when an athlete is on the road, and there might be a different schedule when the athlete is home. It's unique to each sport. It's unique to obviously each athlete. And it also depends on the age of the child, because sometimes the child may visit or spend time with the athlete on the road, obviously not to conflict with school, but it also depends on the age of the child. The other unique issue that comes up all the time, and this is a challenge, is free agency, or when an athlete gets
Right.
traded, right? You hear about the deals, 5 year deals, 10-year deals. And look, so much goes on, and we often wonder, as fans of different athletes, why someone signs a 10-year deal. Why does someone sign an 8-year deal to play for a team that never wins? And, as fans, we question it. But there's so much more that goes into these deals in terms of stability and consistency for families. But what happens if that consistency is upended? What happens if an athlete gets traded from Colorado to where you are to New York, and then the athlete finishes the season in New York and then gets traded somewhere else, or there's where the athlete's a free agent? And so things are constantly changing, constantly moving. So planning, getting ahead of it is important, but sometimes you need to be able to have carve outs. And I often do this in agreements where you have carve outs that account for situations such as free agency, such as if an athlete or a player is traded mid-year.
Yeah, and I remember Clayton Kershaw, the Los Angeles Dodgers pitcher. He has kids around. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and he's got kids around the same age. I remember listening to an interview asking him about what it's like to be a dad, and he was talking about how his kid sleeps, and his it was like a newborn, and the newborn was sleeping until like 11 o'clock because he gets home from night games typically, and he spends, and me having some familiarity with professional baseball players. I mean, they're up late at night, so their typical normal day, they start, they typically sleep until 11 or noon because they're up late at night, and their kids and their families have to revolve around that. Same thing with the NBA. I mean, there a lot of these players will talk about, hey, it's great to be on a Christmas day, like when everyone is watching, but it's not so great when you're away from your family. And so when us divorced attorneys, we're having to, I mean, we deal with Christmas or Thanksgiving. Those are those big holidays. And it's different for a professional athlete who might be, playing that day.
It's 100% different. And Ryan, you're spot on. We negotiate agreements all the time, holidays, vacations, school breaks. But it's challenging when you represent athletes and entertainers because of the nuances of their schedules. You're not talking about just factoring in the child's schedule. It's the parent's schedule. Is the parent at home? Is the parent on the road? Where is the parent? Let's say, is it on the West Coast, East Coast? What's the distance? How does someone get there? What's the age of the child? There's so much that goes into this that separates this area of the law. And when you work with an athlete or someone who travels extensively and who spends so much time on the road, yet what makes them so successful financially is also tied to it. So there's so much that goes into it and so much to think about. It's an incredibly challenging area of the
And
law.
I want to wrap up, Evan, when in terms of, I mean, divorce lawyers, we're typically competitive type A people. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of the business. It's also the same thing with, I mean, with athletes and entertainers. I mean, they're really competitive. So how do you balance that competitive aspect? You know, a client that says, you know, I want to win my divorce, and you know, they're competitive. Just that's their personality. How do you reconcile that? Because they're so geared to thinking in winning and losing and results instead of compromise, and because it's counter to what they do as a profession. So how do you deal with that as a divorce lawyer?
Ryan, the way I deal with it is I redefine winning. And you're right. If you're an athlete, you associate winning really just one way. You either win the
Right.
game or you don't. You either score 30 points or you don't. But what I do is I redefine what it means to win, because an athlete needs to change their mindset. It can't be, I need to pay X or I need to pay Y. The way you redefine winning when you represent and work with an athlete or an entertainer, it's about getting it done. It's about avoiding the spotlight. Sure, it's about getting the best possible deal you can, but you also have to be smart as to what you're arguing over and fighting over in terms of getting it done, avoiding the spotlight, avoiding the publicity, moving on, moving forward. There's a price to that. And trust me when I tell you, it is an incredibly valuable
Yeah,
price.
and one thing I will typically do with clients is to ask them, what do you see, you know, your son or daughter's high school graduation like? Or in my mind, a win in a divorce is in 2 years I bump into my client and they say, you know, we're able to get along. I mean, you can't guarantee that, but I'm sure you have seen it where people will fight over something that is really important to them at the time, and you know they get it, or they get what is a great financial deal, but they drive the spouse, the other party, to just despise them so much that it ends up coming back to haunt them in a year or two, when they're having to, especially when they're dealing with kids.
And it's so hard to come back from that. You know, we talked about Tom Brady and that relationship and the blending of families. Once you go to a certain place in a divorce, and it can be an athlete or it can be anyone that we represent, it's so challenging to make that co parenting relationship work again. And there is a benefit financially, but the bigger benefit is with your kids and the relationship and the flexibility that you're going to want from the other parent. You know, people lose sight that co parenting, it's not easy. Things are going to come up, whether you're an athlete and you're traveling and you want your child to come see you play on the road. Well, someone's going to have to get the child there. And so things are going to come up, and you're going to need the other parent's assistance and flexibility and compromise. And so instead of arguing over something that is small or something that you don't really need to fight about, think about all the benefits to not only getting the deal done, but redefine what it means to win and focus on having that great co-parenting relationship going forward and moving on with the process.
Well, Evan, thank you again for the time. It's so interesting. I mean, at least for me, as you know, as an avid sports fan, and you know, a former athlete myself, not on that same level, but I can appreciate those issues, but also the intellectual aspects of dealing with the licenses, the royalties, and the complicated, you know, aspects when a lot is at stake. I mean, millions of dollars typically are being addressed, if not, you know, $1 billion. And so, you know, I really appreciate your insights. For people that want to find out more about you, we mentioned the Schein On podcast. Is that? Can you tell our listeners where can they find that?
Yeah, Ryan, I appreciate it. Again, thank you for having me on. People could follow me on social media, Evan Schein. People could listen to the Schein On podcast, Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever everyone listens to their podcast. My website is berkbot.com. The name of the company and my firm is Berkman, Bottger, Newman, and Schein. And my other website is
And
scheinondivorce.com.
your firm deals with not just entertainment and sports divorces, but you know, generally in New York City or throughout the New York metropolitan area.
Ryan, that's correct. We have 22 attorneys, 4 offices in New York City. We have an office in New Jersey as well. We work and specialize in working with clients going through divorce, all family law, and matrimonial issues. That's our focus, and that's our
Well, you've
specialty.
got the Manhattan in your backdrop there, and now that we can travel, we're recording this post, or at least in the kind of um, travel area, or post COVID, so to speak. So I look forward to visiting New York City. And hey, if you're ever in the Denver area or Aspen, drop a line. Just don't be easy on the Tom Brady references, at least here in Colorado.
Ryan, I would absolutely love that. I'll keep the Tom Brady references to the East Coast. But again, thank you for having me on. I could talk about this stuff all day long. It's such an interesting area of the law, your focus and your specialty in Colorado, what I do here in New York. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks again, Evan.